We're learning the Sikha on Purim Katan and Chelek Chavav on page 209. The Shir today is being learned to the Nishmas, Rabbi Yosef ben Yamin, ben Rabbi Menashe Koltman. The Siyam from Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim is mit der Halachas und Dinim from Purim, Hilchas Megillah. The conclusion in the section of Shulchan Aruch called Orach Chaim, talking about the halachas that apply on a day-to-day basis and the halachas around the cycle of the year. So it concludes with the halachas of Purim or Hilchas Megillah, the halachas of reading the Megillah. Und in dem letzten Simen redt sich wegen the Dinim von Yudalet with Tezvav Adarishon. In the very last Simen, it speaks about the halachas applying to a case where it's a leap year, and you have the 14th and the 15th of Adar, the first month Adar, Adarishon. The time of them bepashtus is the reason simply why this is the last and conclusion of all halachas, Valitzeder Hashana, because following the order of the year, wie in Tor v'Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim sind ausgestellt the halachas von Zmanei Umayde Hashana, as it is both in the Torah and in Shulchan Aruch, where the halachas are presented according to the times of the year. So it begins with the halachas that applies for every Rosh Chodesh, und danach Nissen, Hilchas Pesach, then it begins with the halachas of Pesach, the first month of Nissen. So then, come the dinim from Purim Levaseif. So if you follow that order from Nissen throughout the 12 months of the year, so Purim is at the end. Und das was die dinim von Yudalet Tezvav Adarishon kommen besiyam Hilchas Megillah. Now the fact that the halachas about Yudalet and Tezvav of Adarishon, they are all the way at the end, even though in this case it's not the last month of the year because there is a 13th month, Adar Sheni. Noch die Hilchas Purim, after the halachas of Purim, Afal Piyas in dem Shonim Uberes Gufe, zene ze kodem bezman to the halachas from Purim Shabbat Sheni. In a leap year, they are fulfilled and come before Purim, which is in the second Adar. This is the far, while the dinim zene nit negeh b'chol shana. So simply the reason is because these are not halachas that are relevant every single year. No blois and Hashanah Muberes, only in a leap year. The far haben die dinim from Purim kedima. Therefore the halachas of Purim come first in the halachas before Purim Katan, the halachas of Yudal and Tezvav Adarishon. An additional point can be said about this. As the prati dinim from Yudalet and Tezvav Adarishon, the details of the halachas regarding Yudalet and Tezvav Adarishon, Purim Katan, and within Tainis v'Hesped behen, halachas regarding fasting or a eulogy on this day, zenen amesuviv from the mitzvahs v'dinim shebe Purim. They are really an outcome of the halachas that are mentioned earlier regarding Purim itself. This says what this means is, as the dinim v'chiyuvim from Yudal v'Tezvav Adarishon, the halachas and the obligation, all the obligations of Yudal and Tezvav of Adarishon, and which is ein neflum al paneim, there's no tachanun on this day, and therefore there's also the capital of Yancha said after Ashrei is not said on this day. Vasurim behesped v'tainis, a day forbidden to eulogize or fast. This is not customs and halachas that are based on or connected to what's unique about this day, Yudalet and Tezvav Adarishon, as it is for itself. Rather, it's an outcome of the days of Purim, the yontiv of Purim, and the fulfillment of the mitzvahs of the day that's in the second Adar. Und defar kommen sie noch die halachas v'dinim von Yudal v'Tezvav Adar. So therefore they follow the halachas that apply to Yudal and Tezvav Adar on a regular year where there's 1 month of Adar, the halachas of Purim. Weil die dinim shebesimen zeh kommen als tetzah und mesuviv von die yemei hapurim ha'ikriim, weil chazenachal b'shana zu ha'muberes ba'ad sheni. Because the halachas in this siman regarding Purim Katan in the Adarishon is all just really an outcome of Purim itself, the main celebration of Purim, which in this year falls out in Adar Sheni. So this is the simple explanation for why these halachas are the very last halachas in the Shulchan Aruch in the section of Orach Chaim. However, everything in Torah is exact. It's definitely this way. If this is the case regarding things that happen in the world, everything in the world is with the Hashem's divine providence, exactly and precise. So it's moving if so it's understood as das was the dinner from Purim stehen besiem halachas from Chelek Chaim. The fact that these halachas regarding Purim are at the conclusion of this section of Shulchan Aruch Chaim ubehem atzmam is the seal mit the halachas from Purim Katan, and in these halachas it's the halachas regarding Purim Katan Yudal and V'tezvav Aderishin that are the very last halachas. Is this nit blois the far was azay kumt es ois leit seder as mannen von the halachas. So this is not only because just following the order of the months of the year, this is the order that this is the last halachas, following from what's first and what comes later in time, or as explained within Adar itself, that the halachas of Purim come first because they're more constant, they're every single year. So then automatically it ends up being at the end, at the last halachas, nor rather, this itself, that these halachas, and specifically the halachas of Purim Katan, are taught and are in the very last halacha, this itself is precise, and there's a reason for this. And then was the dinam anal, the fact that the halachas of Purim Katan is the end and the conclusion of this section of Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim. This expresses something about the order in the way the life of a Yid is supposed to be conducted. Since there is the rule that says that you always follow the way things are at the conclusion. Therefore, the very last halachas of Purim Katan in the end of Shulchan Aruch is something which is here to tell us a very important message about the whole entire section of Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, the lifestyle of a Yid. So what's the explanation for this? So seemingly this can be explained mit Hasbaras HaTeichen von der letzte Werte mit welche der Rama is Messiah den Chelek Orach Chaim. So this can be explained with the very last halacha, explaining the content of the very last words that the Rama writes at the end of the Chelek of Orach Chaim. Yesh Eimrim Shachayv Laharbais B'Simcha or B'Mishte V'Simcha B'Yudal Sheba'Aderishin. There's an opinion that one should add an increase in his joy and a festive meal on the Yudalit of the first Adar, Purim Katan, but it's not the custom. However, Yarbe K'tzas B'Suda, one should add a little bit in his meal, in order to follow somewhat this opinion of the ones that are stringent about this. And the Ramak concludes with a lashon of a pasuk, v'toiv leiv mishte tamid. The one with a glad heart is always with joy with a festive meal. Steht in Sfarim. So regarding this conclusion of v'toiv leiv mishte tamid, it says in Sfarim, as the chsime from Ramah is me'en apsiche von Orach Chaim. His conclusion in the very last halacha is similar to his opening in the section of Orach Chaim. The Ramah hyped on mit shivisi avaye lenegdi samid. I place Hashem in front of me constantly, with the word tamid, constantly. On the scene of the chaysim is v'toiv leiv mishte tamid. Similar, the conclusion is that one with a glad heart is always joyous, constantly, with the word tamid. Was die zwei mal tamid zene keneged dishnei tmidim kesidram shnayim layom tamid. The two words tamid here are similar to in the Beis Hamikdash, where every day there was the two karbanis tamid that was brought, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. So one of the explanations of this point here regarding opening with the term of tamid shivisi avayla negdi samid and concluding with the term tamid in v'toiv leiv mishte tamid. The Chelek Orach Chaim besteht von den Mitzvos und Dinim, was der Roten darf mekayim sein tag täglich oder b'meshach kol hayom. It includes all those halachas that a person must fulfill on a daily basis and during the entire day. From the moment he wakes up in the morning and until the time he goes to sleep. Additionally, from the Dinim u Mitzvahs b'meshach yimei hashana kula, al seder hashana, also including the halachas in the cycle of the year, the entire year. Now, the dazige mitzvahs v'dinim zene b'chlal verbunden mit zmanim misuyamim b'meshach hayom v'halayla. So all the mitzvahs and the halachas that we learn in this section of Shulchan Aruch are connected to a certain time period in the day or the night, other b'meshach shana, or during the time of the year, was mizmechuyev zum bekayim zayin in azman b'suyim b'shana, when one is obligated to fulfill these mitzvahs in a specific time period of the year. Und sind nicht shaykh zu einem anderes Mann b'meshach hashana, but they're not applicable in other times of the year. However, the Aschala from Orach Chaim, the very opening of this section, Orach Chaim, and Yeshleimar Oyach Shala Adam, the very opening and foundation of the life of a person, V'siyumai, and then the conclusion, Zanadi Shnei Tmidim, are these 2 points that are constant. V'zeh is ständig. Their obligation is consistent and constant. B'chol zman, the Yimei Chayiv Shala Adam, every moment in the life of a person, B'meshach kol hashana kula, in the entire year, and every single moment of every single day. And these are the 2 things that are mentioned here as Tamid. And therefore, it comes here in Shulchan Aruch in the order of as ein Tamid kommt als Reish v'aschale von Orach Chaim. One thing which is constant is brought right at the beginning, the opening of Orach Chaim. The zweite Tamid als siyumai v'chaismai, and the second Tamid comes at the end and as a conclusion and the close of Orach Chaim, and that is the Aschala from Shulchan Aruch, Shavisi Avaya Lenek Disami, the opening, placing Hashem in front of me constantly, is the Nekudah from Yiras Hashem. This is the point of a Jew constantly standing with awe in front of Hashem. As the Ramah himself explains and elaborates that Kishayasin Ha'adam El Libai, when a person takes the heart, that the great King Hashem, which fills his glory, fills the entire world, Allah is standing upon him, and sees his actions. Immediately, the awe and the submission to Hashem and the dread of Hashem's presence will be upon the person constantly. On the siyum, so this is the opening, the foundation of the point of Yiras Hashem. On the siyum, v'toiv leiv mishta tamid, is the inyan hasimcha, and then the conclusion, the last halacha, where it says that a person should always have a glad heart and a festive meal, which means the joy of a yid in serving Hashem is the inyan of simcha, the joy, which is also a constant, has to constantly be present in the avodah of a yid. Und die 2 Inyanim darf sein bei Modem und Neufung von Tamid. Both of these have to be in a Yid's Aveda constantly, b'chol zman, every time, every moment. In jeder Aveda, was a Yid tut, whatever it is that a Yid is doing, serving Hashem, darf sich beim der Herren der Inyan von Yireh v'achna. He has to sense on one hand a awe and submission to Hashem, und euch der Inyan ha-simcha b'avedas Hashem, and at the same time also a joy in serving Hashem. Ivdu is Hashem b'yira, serving Hashem with awe, and Ivdu is Hashem b'simcha, and serving Hashem with joy. These are the 2 tamids, the 2 constant experiences that a person should be sensing and living with in everything that he does every moment of the day, on every day of the year. And therefore, these are the 2 tamids that is the opening and the conclusion of Shulchan Aruch and the Chelek of Orach Chaim. Now, based on this, Yesh Levayu, we can also explain what the siyum from Orach Chaim is Metilchas Megillah Purim. Why is it that the conclusion of this section, Orach Chaim, is with the halachas of Megillah, the halachas regarding Purim? It says Yidua, so it's known as Fayedes Sug or the Kav Miyuchad and Avedas Hashem, that for every category, every specific pathway in serving Hashem is Farana Yom Zman Kavua B'Shana. There is one day or one time period in the year, welche is B'Myuchad Mesugel U'Masum Fadem Oifen Aveda, which is designated and it's an auspicious time for specifically this way of serving Hashem. Was von dem Zman net men de koyach ben yinzeh v'hashpa oif aveda zu b'meshach kol hashana kula. And it's from this time period that we take the power and there's an influence on the aveda of a person on the rest of the year. And the same applies to serving Hashem with joy. From where do we take the power for every day of the year to serve Hashem always with a glad heart and joy? The simcha, Avedas Hashem, b'meshach kol hashana kula, the joy in Aveda every day of the year. This comes from the days of Purim. Purim is the zman when mizmarbe besude v'simcha b'mida achigedayla. Purim is a day when we add in a festive meal and with joy to the greatest extent, more than any other Yom Tov, any other holiday celebration during the year. In Torah and Shulchan Aruch, as it's brought to the halacha both in Torah and Shulchan Aruch, that mitzvah laharbais besudas Purim, there's a mitzvah to add as much as possible in the meal of Purim. And even more so, that on Purim, a person drinks to the point that he goes out of his boundaries completely. And therefore, Purim is the foundation of the influence of joy in the Aved of a person every day of the year. Now, this is not a contradiction to what's explained in many places as Chag HaSukkos. That actually the Yontiv of Sukkos, which is also referred to as Zman Simchasenu, the time of our joy, is the Makir of Simcha al Kol Hashana Kula. This is the source for the Aveda of joy the entire year. And as it's known, the explanation, as the Inyanim Klali in Avedas Hashem, all the general points about a person's Aveda, we take the power for the fulfillment of this every day of the year from the general month, and that is Chodesh Tishrei. Rosh Hashanah, the Zman from Tamlichoni Aleichem. Rosh Hashanah is a time where we crown Hashem as King. Is there Makif from Velachem Eshept, Yerushalayim, from ganzen Yar. This is the source from where we draw the awe of heaven for the every day of the year. Yom Kippurim, Eifan Inyan Tshuva. Yom Kippur is the source for the Inyan of Tshuva for every day of the year. And from Sukkos, Shmini Atzeres, Simchas Torah, and the entire Sukkos, that including Shmini Atzeres and Simchas Torah, which is all Zman Simchasenu, the days of joy, Netmen dem Koyach, as alle Sachen von Torah and Mitzvahs, B'meshach Hashanah, Zomatom mit Simcha. From here we take the power that everything a Yid does every day of the year in a mitzvah should also be done with this kind of joy. This idea is hinted in the order of how the Rambam brings the concept of serving Hashem with joy. As an inyan from Simcha Shel Mitzvah, speaking about the subject of having joy when you fulfill a mitzvah, in the words of the Rambam, Hasimcha sheyismach adam ba'asiyas hamitzvah chulu, the joy that one should have in fulfilling a mitzvah, aveda gedayle hi chulu. This is a great level of serving Hashem. Where does the Rambam bring this? Kommt als Hemshech von der Simcha Yesera, was is given b'mikdash b'chag HaSukkos. He explains this following what he says regarding the great level of joy that there was, the extra level of joy that there was in the Beis HaMikdash on Sukkos. Because this is the time from when we take that influence and that inspiration for Simcha every day of the year. So now how does this fit with the point we're saying here that Purim is the foundation and the source of inspiration of Simcha for the entire year? So this can be explained as follows. The fact that Sukkot is the foundation and the inspiration of joy for all year is at the time when the Beis HaMikdash is standing. When everything is properly and in their fullest extent, the Far hat man demot gekent mekabel sein chayes and Avodas Hashem b'meshach kol hashana kula from the Yontiv shebechodesh Tishrei. Then it was possible to get the right enthusiasm and involvement of Simcha in one's Aveda and on all other details from the month of Tishrei. Und das ist gewesen maspik. That was sufficient. Weil derach sagt man in dem Inyan Simcha b'Avodas Hashem genommen von dem Simcha Yesera shehoye b'mikdash b'chag HaSukkos. So the same applied also to Simcha, joy that comes from the Simcha, the added level of Simcha that was in the Beis HaMikdash. Mashenkem is man hagolus. However, in the time of exile, in the Zeit von Helen v'Hester, in a time when there is a concealment, is the Ashpas of Simcha b'chag HaSukkos nit maspik zu peil sein in der Aveda von a ganz Jahr. So the influence and the inspiration of Simcha from Sukkot is insufficient to affect the person every day of the year. Because the level of the Simcha as it is in the month of Tishrei, the analogy for this is all of the levels of life that are in every individual limb in the body, which has a unique function, as it's still all in its source, included in the head, in the brain, where there is the source of all those individual functions. But there, though, in the head, you don't yet have the division and the recognition of the separation of one function and another. Was dorten is the chayes hecher von zu ontanzich und mechayes and the ivarim shebeguf. There, the level of life of the soul is still on a level of life that's not related to the individual function once it is in an individual limb in the body. That's what the analogy for Chodesh Tishrei is, the head of the entire year. So, therefore, the same applies also regarding our Aveda in the world. As in Tishrei, steht in Yonei Avodas Hashem, and I feel hechere Darge von zu haben a Sheiches zu der Aveda Pratis The level of a person's Aveda that's all included in the head of the year, in the month of Tishrei, is on a much higher level than any connection where you see the actual individual Aveda as it becomes expressed on a daily basis during the year. So therefore, there must be an inspiration from a Yom Tov that's closer related, and therefore could better empower the Aveda of every single day. So therefore, the source and the inspiration has to come from a day and from a level which is not in the general month of Tishrei of the year, and therefore this can give a closer and more direct inspiration for the level of simcha necessary in the daily Aveda with individual functions that there is in every single day of the year. So therefore here in our case, that toiv leiv, mishte tamid, the glad heart and the joy of Aveda, the simcha tmidis b'meshach yimei hashana, the constant joy in serving Hashem every day of the year, nehmt men von, where does it come from? And yeshloima gam de chag HaSukkos, that we can even add that this includes also the level of joy that there is on Sukkot itself. So we take this be'emtsois, the simcha should be mea Purim, that it comes through the intermediary of the joy that there is on the day of Purim. Purim is a day in the year, it's not in Tishrei, in the head of the year. And also the joy of the day of Purim is a day of joy that's in the days of Purim, in the days of the year that is, and it's something that comes from the condition of exile, and it's based on a miracle that happened in the times of exile. Even more so, these are days, it's a day that one may do regular work on this day, like every other day of the year. Und kann sein, die Simche tmidis in jedem Matzev, was Hayid gefindt sich, and therefore they can bring a constant joy in every situation a person is in, euch in a wochendigen golesdige Maimede Matzev, including in a weekday and a golesdige, and a exile condition of the Yid that he's in. That's why it's necessary to have put him there to take and bring that joy of Tishrei, which is the head of the year, and carry it down to the level of joy necessary to be applied on a daily basis. And therefore Purim serves as the focal point of the Simcha, that's the inspiration for the entire year. Now, based on this, this is the difference between the way the Rambam brings up the inyan of Simcha in serving Hashem and the way it's brought here in Shulchan Aruch. The Rambam speaks in his Sefer about all matters as they are also in their fullest extent. Including when the Beis HaMikdash is standing. Was Bisman Abayis is the Nisinis Koyach of Simcha Shon Mitzvah from the Simcha Yisera Shebechag HaSukkos Shebemikdash. And the time when the Beis HaMikdash is standing, the joy of a mitzvah comes from the added Simcha that there was in Sukkos, in the Beis HaMikdash, and that's where the Rambam brings the inyan of Simcha for every mitzvah, coming from the Simcha on Sukkos time. In Shulchan Aruch, it only brings the halachas that are relevant today, in Golas time. And today, the main power and the inspiration of Simcha comes from the days of Purim. Und der Fakt kommt der Inyan von Toiv Leiv Mishte Tamid als Hemshech v'chaisim von halachas Megillah, Hilchas Megillah Purim. Therefore, the idea of Toiv Leiv Mishte Tamid, speaking about the consistent and constant joy every single day, is in Shulchan Aruch and in the Ramah brought in connection to Hilchas Purim, which is relevant for the time of Galus. This is the explanation for not only the very last words, Toiv Leiv Mishte Tamid, but in general regarding Purim being the last halachas, because this Purim is the Yom Tov that's the inspiration of serving Hashem b'simcha every single day of the year. This explanation, though, is still yet not the full story of why this is the very last halachas in Shulchan Aruch. Valdemit is mavur blaze the shayches from Siyam Shulchan Aruch to Purim Bechlal. This only explains the connection of the conclusion of Shulchan Aruch to the Yom Tov of Purim in general. Es bleibt aber nicht klar, but it's still not a clear explanation. The time was to see him a Shulchan Aruch is mit the halachas from Purim Katan. Why is it that the conclusion of Shulchan Aruch concludes with Purim Katan, which is in the Adoration? Warum wie bald alle in Yorim in Teire seine Bediya Kanal, since everything in Teire is precise, darf man sagen, as the Siyam von Eure Chaim hat Shayches miyachedet zu dem Teichene Inyan from Purim Katan. Therefore, it must be said that the conclusion of Eure Chaim, the lifestyle of a Yid, is specifically connected to the content of Purim Katan. Seemingly, what could be said, based on what we explained here before, as the Bir Anal Siv Gimel, the explanation before in Siv Gimel, Gufe, this itself, git euch an Art zu Madgir sein, die Shayches Asim, zu Purim Katan, noch mehr wie zu Purim Bechlal. This shows us why we should highlight the connection specifically to Purim Katan even more than Purim itself. Why is this? Purim Afal Purim is mutter ba'asiyas malacha. Although the case is that Purim is a day that one may do work on this day, and therefore it's a day that is connected, related to every day of the year. Therefore, it's a good inspiration for simcha on a daily basis. Is it aber a tag was is ausgeteilt b'ribui mitzvahs? On the other hand, though, it is still a day that's not like every other day of the year. It's very different with all the many mitzvahs that must be fulfilled on this day. Kriyas Megillah, Mishloach Manos, and Matanas Lav Yainim. Reading the Megillah, and then the other mitzvahs of the day, Ubitfilah v'chulu, and extra davening on this day. And therefore, that takes up a big part of the day. Purim Katan, however, on the day of Purim Katan, was is nit verbunden mit mitzvahs miyachadais. It's a day of joy, but there is no unique obligations of mitzvahs on this day. Hat der Rebbe noch an nentere Shayches mit die Kol Yemei Hashana. It's even closer related to every day of the year. And therefore it has even more of an inspiration to bring the joy on a regular day, on a daily basis during the year. Therefore, Purim Katan expresses the idea explained before to an even greater extent. However, this point is not true. There has to be another explanation here. Weil Aleph, number one, this is a good explanation according to those opinions, as the Ramah begins, that say that one should add in the joy on Yudalad Aderishan on Purim Katan. Aber the Ramah is doch mamshech. However, the Ramah himself says that's not our custom. One should add a little in the meal to be somewhat for the opinions that are stringent about this. How could you say that Purim Katan will be a source for the joy of the entire year if on this day itself there is no obligation of simcha? Beis ve'ikir, and the second and main point here is Vikam Zagan as the Nesinis Kayach of Mishta Tamid Simchet Midis B'chol Shana V'Shana is from Purim Katan. How can you say that the source of joy every single year comes from Purim Katan, Velche is Doch Blois B'Shana B'Uberes, which is only on some years, and a year that's a leap year. So therefore there must be an additional point about Purim Katan, which is the reason why Bashkacha Pratis in Teire, in this section of Shulchan Aruch, Eir Chaim, this is the last halacha that is relevant for every day of the year. So we can understand this. Let's have a better explanation in the words of the Ramah, quoting the pasuk V'toiv leiv mishta tamid. Was wie gebracht früher von Sfarim is das Merames auf in Inyan as-simche ba'avedas Hashem. As quoted earlier, it says in Sfarim that this hints to a person's joy in serving Hashem. Now, seemingly the question here is, as mentioned before, there's the Tamid, and that Tamid is where in the beginning of Shulchan Aruch. So why is it that the two Tmidim that I mentioned, why are they put in the Shulchan Aruch with this order? As Shivisi Avayla Negdi Samid Kon Bas Chalas Shulchan Aruch. That's all the way at the beginning. That comes at the end, after all the halachas are done, and here we say that there has to be simcha constantly. Why is it only all the way at the end? Shvisi Availa Negdi Summit is a Yisaid V'ikir and Avedis Hashem. Being that placing Hashem in front of you constantly is a foundation and a primary point in serving Hashem. Und der Fahrer ist der Reish, was Chelek, so ganz Erechaim, and therefore it comes at the beginning of Shulchan Aruch. Darf doch me'ein zeh sein, bin a geil inyan v'toiv leiv mishta tamid. So similar should also be regarding the constant joy in a person's Aveda, that it should be all the way at the beginning. Val oich simcha is an inyan yisaidi in Avedas Hashem. Serving Hashem with joy is a fundamental point in Avedas Hashem. Anebendik von Tfilas Kailol Birchas HaShachar, right at the first moments of the day when one davens, and even the brachas that one says in the morning. So the explanation for this is the 2 points of Tamid, Bas Cholas Erechaim, V'siyumai, at the beginning of Shulchan Aruch, and at the conclusion of Erechaim, Meint der Rama, the Zweit Nues, what the Rama is hinting to here, is the 2 points, nit wie sie kommen als a Teil von Avedas Hashem. Not the 2 points as part of the way, the attitude the person has in serving Hashem. In other words, Kiyum HaShulchan Aruch, the fulfillment of all the details in the Shulchan Aruch. Nor rather, wie sie kommen als Aleph, Hagdome Lifnei Cholas V'Kiyum HaShulchan Aruch. One Tamid is what's constant and what's a foundation before one begins learning all the details of Shulchan Aruch. Und als Beis, Siyum La'acharei Gemara Kiyum HaShulchan Aruch. And then there's the point that comes at the end, which is here at the end because this is only relevant and comes out expressed only after one completes all his Aveda and all the details in Shulchan Aruch. And the point is as follows. Eider Ayid Hauptan Avedasai, Bekiyam At-Torah Mitzvahs, Fadet sich frier, the Shvisi Avail Negdi Summit. Before Ayid begins his Aveda, before he even begins doing anything, he first must have Hashem in front of him constantly. And that's the Kabbalah's Malchusay Yisbarach, accepting Hashem as a king. Ubeloshen Chazal, using the expression that it says in the Mishnah, Yikabal Olav El Malchus Shemayim Tchila. First, one has to identify Hashem as his king before there's any details of his commands or a mitzvah. Then you could talk about the details of what the king wants and what he commands you to do. And therefore, in the Shulchan Aruch, when it begins, it's beginning with the point of Kabbalah's Malchusi Yisbarach. At di Kabbalah von El Malchusi Yisbarach. So this acceptance of Hashem as king steht, al kaponim darf stehen, begaloi eder. Es haupt sich an die Avede bepeil von Kiyum HaTorah Mitzvahs. This is something that has to be present. It is present, or at least should be present, in a revealed sense, before a person even begins any details in his Aveda. Nachdem wir erscheinen, reingetan in Kiyum HaTorah Mitzvahs, once you begin your Aveda with a certain detail involved in fulfilling a specific mitzvah, is nit nirgash begaloi die Tnuah von Kabbalah Malchus. At that point, the person is not living with that acceptance, that initial acceptance of Hashem as my king, when he's busy with the details of one specific mitzvah. Das, was nimmt an auf sich, zu eisfolgen bepeil, die Gzeras, vitzivi HaMelech. Rather, just skipped a few words here, nor the Kabbalah's el mitzvahs. What the person does feel at that point is that now he accepts the yoke of the fulfillment of this mitzvah, which he's involved now in. Das, was nimmt an auf sich, zu eisfolgen bepeil, die Gzeras, vitzivi HaMelech. So it's 2 different points. There is accepting Hashem as king. That's the general identity of who the person is, that I belong to Hashem. And then the fulfillment of this, now I exist and I'm focusing on what I have and who I am and how I utilize all the faculties Hashem gave me to serve Hashem. That comes after the general acceptance of understanding that one belongs to Hashem completely. That's in the opening of the Shulchan Aruch. Und danach, and then following this, beim Siyum Gemar, la'achrei ha'aveda, when one completes and he's done with his Aveda, is da der inyan von v'toiv leiv mishta tamid. Here, the Shulchan Aruch, the Rama, concludes with the words toiv leiv mishta tamid, with the inyan of simcha, which means nachdem virat mesayim gewen avedasai, after he completes his Aveda fully, kommt der inyan aschar von der Aveda. Now comes the reward for everything that he's done. Was das ist die Simche, was a Yid hat davon. This is the joy that a Yid gets from the fact, was hat durchgeführt, Avedasai, und ist durch dem geworden, behaftet mit dem Eibischen. That he has fulfilled and completed his Aveda, and he's become completely connected to Hashem, mitzvah, moloshen tzavse v'chibber. That's what a mitzvah is, besides meaning a command, it also means a connection. So the simcha we're talking about here is the great joy that a person experiences when he's fulfilled, when he has fulfilled and he has completed all of the mitzvahs. Und die Simche kann man haben begalloi erst achrei gemar aveda. This level of simcha is not during the time when a person serves Hashem with the mitzvahs, but at the conclusion. Because b'shas that tuti aveda at the time when a person is serving Hashem is afal pias does dav zayin b'toich simcha. Everything has to be done with an attitude of joy. If du es Hashem b'simcha v'balt ove. Is done inmitten sein vernumigkeit and avedas Hashem. However, since at that time the person is occupied with the details that he has to do to serve Hashem, he can't be expressing purely and completely the joy that he has with Hashem. Because at that moment, when he has to fulfill and follow the command that Hashem has asked him to do, he has to feel the sense of responsibility and accepting the yoke of heaven and the awe of heaven in his fulfilling of the mitzvah. Which is a necessary attitude to have while you're busy doing what Hashem asks you to do. Only when one completes his Aveda, after one completes his Aveda, now the joy of the fulfillment of the mitzvah, which brought him closer, connected to Hashem, now he can take in and experience fully that level of joy that he has as a result of this new level of connection to Hashem that was created through the mitzvah. Again, bringing the example of the month of Tishrei, this is similar also in this month, which is the general month of the year. But Rosh Hashanah v'chulu is Yomim Neirayim. Rosh Hashanah is part of the days of awe. Aveda fon v'gilu b'ra'ada. It's a time when one serves Hashem with joy, which is what the meaning of the word v'gilu means, but b'ra'ada, with a strong level and sense of awe, trembling, standing in front of Hashem. To say what this means is, for piyas demult is da inyan gila v'hasimcha. On Rosh Hashanah as well, there's a concept of joy. And the other Rabbi, asimcha gedayla b'yaiser, the fun that is mamlech, the meibishn als melech. There's a tremendous level of joy with this, that one can crown Hashem as a king. Is this aber melubish in the yire v'gilu berada. However, this is all cloaked in the attitude of tremendous level of awe when you crown Hashem as your king. The gilu yasimche, however, now the expression of the joy that Hashem is my king, when does that come out? Is b'siyum ha'moedim, by the conclusion of the Yamim Tovim of the month of Tishrei, b'chag ha'sukkis, man simchaseinu, on Sukkis, the days of joy, u'be'ikir b'siyumei mamish, and primarily at the conclusion of Sukkis itself, b'simchas Torah. On the day of Simchas Torah, it's pure joy. So similar here at this point that we're discussing regarding the Toiv Leiv Mishta Tamid at the conclusion of Shulchan Aruch, der Gili Simcha kommt la'achrei gemara aveda in dem Siyum Mamish von Eure Chaim. When is the full expression of pure joy with Hashem Himself, not with the details of the yoke that one has in fulfilling the mitzvah with the awe of heaven, that comes out purely after the Aveda is done, when he experiences his full connection to Hashem, and that's at the conclusion of Eire Chaim. This is the explanation of the two Tomids, the two Tmidim, that there are in the beginning of Shulchan Aruch, in the Ramah, and at the conclusion of the Ramah, at the end of Eire Chaim. Und das ist der Chiluk, wie der Inyan HaSimcha Retzach in Rambam, und wie Retzach in Ramah. Once again, we return to explaining the difference of how the subject of joy is brought up in the Rambam, and as it's brought up in the Ramah. The Rambam is wegen Simcha Shel Mitzvah. The Rambam is discussing the Simcha of the Mitzvah itself, which is HaSimcha Sheyismach HaAdam Be'asiyas HaMitzvah, the joy of the person while he's fulfilling this mitzvah. Und die Simche nimmt sich von der Simche Yesera, was ist gewähnt bei Chag HaSukkos. This joy stems from the added level of joy that there was in Sukkos, was is a tale from the mitzvah Simche Shel HaMoedes. And this is part of the general mitzvah of Simche that there is in Yom Tovim, the fulfillment of the mitzvahs of the Yom Tov. Wie der Rambam sagt dort, as the Rambam there elaborates. So the Rambam is focusing on the Simcha during the attitude in the fulfillment of the mitzvah. In Shulchan Aruch be'retzach wegen Toiv Leiv Mishta Tamid. However, in Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah brings the pasuk of Toiv Leiv Mishta Tamid, and that is the Simcha b'fnei atzma, speaking about joy in itself. Vitzadem was mis aid und ständig beheft mit dem Eibischen, by the very fact that he is a Jew and therefore constantly one with Hashem. And this point about this pure joy of the very identity of the Yid that's close and one with Hashem, that's expressed when a person is done his Avedis Hashem. Und die Simche drückt sich aus in dem Teichen from Purim Katan befrat. Now we'll understand that this concept of joy is actually expressed specifically on Purim Katan, more than on any other day of the year. Yemei Simcha, from Kol Hashana Kula, the days of joy that there are in other days of the year, haben mitzvahs, halachis, minhagim, verbunden mit dem Tag. There are mitzvahs or halachis or customs that are connected to that day. Also as the Hegesh Simcha wird euch bewirkt für die andere Inyanim v'hergeshim, welche kommen le bitte b'avedas Hashem, asiyas mitzvah, kiyem minig, v'chayetz b'zeh. So therefore the joy in this time period and other days of joy of the year, this feeling of joy is also included with, and it gets influenced by, the feelings that one has with the other responsibilities and actions and or customs that there are on those days of the year. Afila di simcha von Purim, and this includes even the simcha of Purim, the greatest day of joy of the year, was dav zayin ad deloy yoda, that a person has to completely go out of his boundaries. Is das aber nit a Sach, was nimmt dem ganzen Tag? However, the joy of Purim is not something that is every moment of the day. As then noch mitzvahs hayoim, there are other mitzvahs of the day in welche verlangen yoda davke, and they demand that one should be very conscious and aware of the particular details of what he's doing. Kanal, as mentioned before, Kriyas Megillah, Mishlech, Manas, Matanis, Lav, Yainu, Chulu, the mitzvahs of the day that have to be done right. The Adarabe, Noigin, Lasis, Sudis Purim, Esh, Lachrim, Minche. On Purim, the custom is that the Suda of Purim, the pure joy of the day, only begins later in the day, after Minche. Masha'en came Purim Katan, however, by contrast, Purim Katan, Hotnit came mitzvahs, miyuchadis, b'yayim zeh. There is no specific mitzvahs or obligations or customs of the day. Die Sach mit welche der Tag wird ausgeteilt von andere Tag. The only thing that this day of the year is different than any other day is mit der Simcha Shabbai. That it's a day that there's joy on this day. Kommt aus, if so it comes out, as in der Simcha von Purim Katan, is nicht areingemischt, kein andere Inyanim verbunden mit Avedis Hashem. So it's a Simcha b'toyar rasa. B'toyar others. It comes out that Purim Katan is that one day of the year, that there's nothing else that's mixed into the Simcha that's here. The entire theme of the day is just Simcha, a pure Simcha of who the Yid is, that he is one with Hashem, not applying it to any specific details or obligations, but just this, that he's B'Simcha, being one with Hashem. So therefore, the ultimate Simcha is expressed on the day of Purim Katan, and therefore this is the conclusion of Shulchan Aruch for the Hashpah, the inspiration of real, pure Simcha for the entire year. Based on this, we can also explain the Msiyim Lashon Ramah, the Toiv Leiv Mishta Tamid, the Ramah that uses this pasuk, that one with a glad heart is always with a festive meal, always with joy. And to explain what the Ramah means to say by this, Ubahagdim, let's first see what it says in the Taz. The Ramah brings the opinion that says that there's an obligation to increase in Simcha, like on Purim, and so the same on Purim Katan. Then the Ramah says that this is not our minig. And he adds, you should add a little bit, and he concludes with the pasuk Toiv Leiv Mishta Tamid. Stellt sich the Taz im Breng, so the Taz stops on this point, and he quotes, B'hagot Tashbeit Simen Kufa and Ches Kosav, that in the Tashbetz, in Hagah of the Tashbetz, it says, the Yesh Laharbais, that one should increase in Simcha on this day, like the first opinion. Rabbi Yechiel mi Paris, one of the Bali Tosfos, Rabbi Yechiel, he writes, Rogel Laharbais V'Lahazmen B'nei Adam. He would invite guests to come and join to celebrate in the joy on Purim Katan as well. K'mashmas Lashon HaMishnah, like the simple meaning in the language of the Mishnah, that Ein Bein Adar Chulu, the Mishnah there says there's no difference between the first Adar and the second Adar, besides a few details that's mentioned, but otherwise it's the same level of joy. V'shapir Misayim Ramah, so therefore the Ramah concludes, and it's understood what he's hinting with this, that V'toiv Leiv Mishta Tamid, that one with a glad heart is always having a festive meal, hinting to this, that he should fulfill this opinion that it's a mitzvah to be marba b'simcha on Purim Katan. So the fun is verstandig, based on the Taz's explanations understood. As the Taz learned with them, was the Ramah is Messiah, the Toiv Leiv Mishta Tamid, that the Taz's understanding that the conclusion of the Ramah with this pasuk of the Toiv Leiv Mishta Tamid meint that zu bevaranen und andeiten, he wants to clarify and hint as sof is nit genug der Yar b'ktsas besuda, that in the end it's not enough just to add a little in the meal on Purim Katan, was sagt früher, as you mentioned earlier. But one should add in the meal and in the joy, similar to Adasheni, and like the Mishnah says, that we don't distinguish between Adarishan and Adasheni. But the tzarich biyod, so this has to be clarified in the words of the Ramah. Und das Meram is mit den Loschen, v'toiv leiv, Mr. Tamid. Why doesn't the Ramah say explicitly the minig that one should add in the simcha of Purim Katan? And why does he hint this by quoting the pasuk of v'toiv leiv, Mr. Tamid? So based on what we learned before, we can say as follows. As das is al derech wie die chilukim, was me gefind in darges chiyuv simcha b'chlal. This is similar to the different levels of joy and the obligation of joy that we find in general in other places. There's the obligation of simcha on a yom tov, achiyev min ha-teireh. It's an obligation min ha-teireh v'samachta b'chagecha, to be b'simcha and the yom tov. That's one level of simcha. The simcha was verbunden mit nisach hamayim v'chag ha-sukkis. Then there's a level of joy connected to the pouring of the water on the mizbeach and sukkis. Was nisach hamayim hu halacha l'Moshe misinai she'einem mefurish behedye b'teireh shebiksav rak derabanan eschamcho ha'akroi. So this nisach hamayim, the pouring of the water, is not clearly in a pasuk. It's learned from halacha that was received from Moshe by Har Sinai. It's not clear in the pasuk, and the Rabbanan though do find a hint in the pasuk for this. But this is Simchas Beis HaSheyeva. That's the simcha on Sukkot, this added level of simcha at the Simchas Beis HaSheyeva. Und es ist da die Simcha, was ist verbunden mit HaKofis, b'Shmini Atzeres, the Simchas Teireh. Then there's the simcha, the joy that there is in the time of that Kofis. Was ist nicht kein Chiyuv in Divrei Seifrim. It's also not an obligation mit Rabbanon. Now, Blaisa Minig, it's just a custom. So you would think that the level of simcha that's only a custom is less than the level of simcha that's midrabanan, and the level of simcha midrabanan is less than the simcha where it's an obligation minatayra. Zetman b'poyel, however, in actuality, we see as the simcha from Simchas Beis HaSheyeva is a simcha gedola yoseh. The simcha in connection to a mitzvah midrabanan, the Simchas Beis HaSheyeva is a greater simcha in the language of the Rambam, simcha yisera, an added level of simcha, legabi simchas yantiv b'chlal, comparing to the level of simcha of yantiv in general. On the simcha von HaKofis is keminig Yisrael noch grasser. And then the simcha on HaKofis, as the custom by Yidden is, it's even to a greater extent. On in Simchas Beis HaSheyeva is eine Faranchi looking zwischen Yidden and Eifan HaSimcha. When it comes to Simchas Beis HaSheyeva, there are different degrees and levels of the participation in the Simcha. Lehoyu Eisen Eisa El Gedoyle V'Anshe Maisa. Who was involved in the Simcha of Simchas Beis HaSheyeva? Only the great people, the leaders, and the people of good deeds. Mashenkin Kala all the other people, Ban Lirais V'Lishmaya, they only came to observe, to watch, and to hear the experience of the joy in the Beis HaMikdash. Aber in the Simcha von HaKofis, sind alle Yidden sich mishtatev. By the Simcha of HaKofis, here, all Yidden come and join together in the joy of the HaKofis. So this shows that this is a higher level of Simcha. So how could this be? Why something which is only a custom is a greater level of joy? Is Mavur Bezeh, so the explanation for this is, as he and his son is, this itself is the point. Was tiefer und größer die Simcha als weniger der Teikef Achiev. The deeper and greater the level of joy is, the less the level of obligation will be. The simcha kommt von der Midden Atzmai, because the joy stems from the Jew himself. There's no need for any obligation. Valderech, the Meile von Divrei Seifrim of Divrei Teireh. Similar to what we see, the Gemara says that there's an advantage in things that the Chachamim added to what it says in the Teireh. Kamay Merazal, as the expression the Gemara says, Arevim alai divrei seifrim and chavivim alai divrei seifrim. And the Rebbe is highlighting the word alai, that it's on me, meaning the Yidden, the Chachamim, they are the ones that are adding this detail there, and that's the source of why this is something which is more beloved and sweeter. And then was Yidden nemen of sich on gedorim v'chumris v'shteinit mefurish and teirish b'ksav, by the fact that Yidden accept upon themselves additional boundaries and stringencies that are not explicit in the Torah. Zetzach de chavivos, simche, v'tainog, v'sidin nabin, and kim ratzon elyon. This expresses the great love and joy and pleasure that you can have in fulfilling the will of Hashem. And therefore applying it here to our point regarding simche. The simche, simche, which is in those cases a yom tiv, where there's an explicit obligation to the Torah, the seist. This is a level of simcha which is the basic level that you could obligate everybody and equally to fulfill. So this is a level of simcha that applies to all people, even one that's on a basic and low level. Then the simcha yiseda from Simchas Beis HaSheva, the added level of joy that was by Simchas Beis HaSheva, verbunden mit Nisach HaMayim, connected to the pouring of the water on the Mizbeach, velachis is nitok in chiyuv, mefurish and teirish b'ksav. There's no clear obligation in the pasuk. Vayisef agresere, und tifere simcha. There's less of an obligation there because it stems more from the Jew himself. On hakafis, was is nit ken chiyuv, and then when you come to the hakafis, that's not an obligation at all. Oich nit a chiyuv de rabbanon, not even mit rabbanon, nor blois a minig. It's only a custom. Diriktais noch a tifer simche. This expresses an even deeper level of joy, welche kommt mitzad Yidden, which comes purely from the Yid itself. Was zij have mechadish gewen eingeführt die simche. The Yidden themselves, with their custom, created this level of joy. It comes because it stems from the very essence of who the Yid is, one with Hashem. And therefore, similar, we can also apply, and the Yisayim is, and actually to an even greater extent, has been a geil Purim Katan. It can be said about the day of Purim Katan. Das was der Ramah bringt, dem laharbes besimche, nor besignen v'oifen shel remes v'sipper. The Ramah quotes the added level of joy of Purim Katan, not as an obligation at all. He just brings it as a hint and as a matter of fact in the language of the pasuk, as the Taz explains. Because this is such a great level of joy. There's no obligation explicit in Shulchan Aruch, not even as a custom either. Al derech with the minig, ha'akaf is the Shmini Atzeres is Simchas Torah, like the custom of Simchas Torah, was steht nicht in Shulchan Aruch, that although it does not say as a halach in Shulchan Aruch, but al kapanim in the Ramah though it does say this as a custom, which obligates one to fulfill this. Or Kalishayna, as the Ramah writes, v'koyden Yom Tov Achrin Simchas Torah, the last day of Sukkot is referred to as Simchas Torah, l'fisha smeichen, v'oisim v'yisudis mishta l'gmara shal Torah chulu, because there's a special joy for concluding the Torah. And v'oid nagul lahakif from Sefer Torah chulu v'hakam mishum simcha, and you go around the bima with the Sefer Torah expressing this joy. But when it comes to Purim Katan, though, it does not mention the simcha of this day even as a minig either. V'ala minig was breitzach in Ramah is echadin v'chiyuv. If the Ramah says this as a custom, then it becomes a halacha and an obligation as well. But here, though, it just says, in a matter of fact, with a hint that this is a time of joy, like one that's always joyous. What's the reason for this? The answer, the reason here is, the Hainu Kanal, as explained before, while the Simcha from Purim Katan, because the Simcha of this day, Purim Katan, is al derech v'di Simcha was kommt begemar ula achar aveda. This is the Simcha that comes when one is done and completed his Avedas Hashem. It says la'achrei un hecher from Aveda, which means that is when one goes to a level higher of the details that he's doing in his Aveda, or b'meila hecher from eze oifen shel chiyuv, and therefore on a higher level of anything that it would be appropriate to speak about an obligation. The Simcha kommt vert mitzad Yidden. The Simcha comes and it happens from the Jew himself, that discovers his unique connection and oneness with Hashem, which is pure, absolute pure joy on this day. Or to say this point in a little different words, if there were to be a obligation or custom even for the simcha of this day, so this would mean simcha al tzachelek from chiyuv kiyam Shulchan Aruch. So this is a joy as part of fulfilling an obligation set in Shulchan Aruch. In them was dann reingemischt an ihm von Eil v'yireh. While you're involved in the details of the Aveda that one does, there has to be some level of responsibility and awe of Hashem in getting it right and fulfilling what He's doing. And therefore here it's hard to focus on the pure joy of the very identity of the Yid. That comes out when one completes his Aveda and he feels the deep connection that there is with the Yid himself and Hashem. Yeshloimar, the far. Now, based on this, we can say that it's for this reason, as di simcha, it's this joy mentioned here, the Agdame was bring the simcha l'asad love. This is the introduction that will lead us into the pure joy that will be when Mashiach comes. Wie der Magen Avraham bringt, Arab, of Divrei Ramah, the Magen Avraham here quotes at the conclusion of Shulchan Aruch on the words of the Ramah, the Tovlev Mishta Tamid, so he adds, B'simchais mitzvahs Elokeinu, with the joy of the mitzvahs of Hashem, Lahamid Oz Yimaleis Chaypinu. We come to bring the time when our mouth will be filled completely with laughter. So the Rebbe highlights the word Yimale, meaning the ultimate and fullest extent of pure joy. When Mashiach comes, it will be the everlasting joy al Reisham on the heads of Yidden, which also means the constant simcha and the level of simcha as it is for itself, the pure joy of a Yid with Hashem. This is accomplished through adding in joy now in the time of exile, and constantly adding in holiness in this level of simcha, adding in the holiness of this pure joy. So this brings speedily in our time, as the Magen Avraham says, this expression, mamish, literally, simchas olam al reisham, the everlasting joy of Mashiach.